Good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever in the world you are, and welcome to the Institute for Policy Studies panel discussion on democratic backsliding and people's resistance in India. First, a few words about the Institute for Policy Studies. We are one of the oldest multi-issue progressive think tanks in the United States. We were founded in the early 1960s, mainly as a vehicle for um, resisting the war in Vietnam. But over the years, we have expanded into other issue areas, um, including economic justice, racial justice, climate justice, which is the project I lead at IPS, and also democracy and human rights writ large, because we recognize that you cannot address any of these issues in isolation. They are all interconnected. And to give you a few words about the background to this event. So as pretty much most people recognize today, the United States is in the grip of authoritarianism. Our government is increasingly authoritarian and democratic rights are disappearing by the day. Now, none of this happened overnight. The democracy that we've had, such as we've had in the United States, has always been deeply flawed. It has always concentrated power in the elite. But regardless, there is a qualitative difference between what it used to be and what it's rapidly becoming today. And in that context, we at IPS recognize that we need to learn from movements in other parts of the world who have confronted authoritarianism in a more advanced stage for some time, often going back decades. And so we started this series of events on what can we in the United States learn from struggles against authoritarianism all over the world. And we've had events on lessons from the Philippines, South Korea, Brazil, and Hungary. And as part of that same series, we are looking at lessons from India, where for the last 11 years, we have had the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP government led by Narendra Modi, which has rapidly dismantled democratic institutions in India. And again, much like the United States, democracy in India was never perfect. It's always been flawed. But under BJP rule, it has pretty much disappeared in many important ways. As our illustrious panelists today will explain in more detail. And just so as not to leave you in a state of despair, we are also going to talk about movement successes in India, how people have resisted and how that resistance has actually had an impact and what we can learn from that as well. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Riya Chakrabarty. She's the Senior Policy Director at Hindus for Human Rights, where she works on advocacy efforts in collaboration with government actors. She has led efforts in support of Indian democracy and the release of political prisoners, among other human rights-focused initiatives. Throughout her career, Riya has focused on understanding the effects of US foreign policy on communities worldwide. She has also worked in various positions in the United States Senate and the World Health Organization. She graduated from the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas with a Master's of Global Policy Studies. And Ria, I didn't realize you were also a UT Austin alum. I am too.
Oh, amazing.
So, yeah, on to you, Ria.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. As Vasav just said, like Indian democracy is in a bit of a crisis right now. And to kind of get a measure of that, you can look at what are the international measures, as flawed as they may be. How do they talk about democracy and human rights in India? So the Varieties of Democracy Institute considers India to be an electoral autocracy, meaning that it's basically an authoritarian state that holds elections, and has also characterized India as one of the fastest autocratizing countries in the world. So the pace at which democratic backsliding is happening is truly some of the fastest in the world. Freedom House considers India to be partially free. And then the US Holocaust Memorial Museum has said that India is the fifth most likely country to experience a mass atrocity event. And since Narendra Modi has been in power every year, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum has said that India is one of the 10 countries most likely to experience a mass atrocity event. The Committee to Protect Journalists says that India is one of the 15 deadliest countries for journalists. Again, this is a pretty consistent ranking. Not only are journalists killed at a very high level, but the people who kill journalists often don't face legal punishments for their actions. And then Reporters Without Borders says that India is 151st in its press freedom rankings. If you look at a map that the Reporters Without Borders will publish of press freedom around the world, India is one of the ones that are in the deep red category. So obviously this is not a healthy democracy in 2025. And I'll get into it, but there have been serious questions as well about the electoral integrity of India today. As Vasif also mentioned, Indian democracy has always been deeply flawed. That is partially because of the way Indian society has been unequal, but also a lot of the legal tools that Narendra Modi has used to dismantle democracy systematically are tools that were available to him before he entered office. In Kashmir and in Northeast India, even before 2014, if you were to ask someone from Manipur or from Kashmir what they think about Indian democracy, they would have said, well, in our part of the country, there really isn't democracy. And a big reason for that is a law called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which allowed the Indian Army to conduct military operations within Indian territory. And because of that, in these places in particular, you would see a heavy military presence, and you would see a permission structure to allow Indian soldiers or give Indian soldiers impunity to commit human rights violations. Since 2014, these places have also experienced even more violence, even more repression. So like I said, Modi is really like he's a changing moment, right? India did have a moment of authoritarianism in the 70s called the emergency, but it was temporary, and it's characteristically different than what happened now. India has been building to this moment, and part of that is because of the Hindu nationalist movement. So this movement comes from the early 20th century with the founding of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. It was presented as an alternative to the democratic movement that eventually won India its independence. Hindu nationalists believed that an independent India could only thrive if Indians rallied around a nationalist Hindu identity and were led by a strong authoritarian. So in the 1920s and 30s, this sounds very, very familiar, right? And actually, Hindu nationalist leaders visited Italy and Germany and took direct inspiration from fascist leaders to create the RSS and the Hindu nationalist movement. And indeed, the RSS is directly influenced by the brown shirts and the black shirts of Germany and Italy. Despite that, Hindu nationalism was usually considered a fringe in Indian politics, but even so, was able to influence events in India. So one of the most infamous events is that an RSS member had assassinated India's national icon, Mahatma Gandhi, and did so because he believed that Gandhi had given away too much to the Muslims, whatever that meant to him. At the same time, that even though the RSS was banned right after Gandhi's assassination and again during the emergency, the movement methodically carved a path to the mainstream, and it did so partially by creating cultural institutions, but also by playing a game in the politics of India. It would collaborate with other political parties, but also by the 80s built its own political party, the Bharatiya Janata Party. And an important member both of the BJP and someone who cut his teeth in the RSS is the current Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And so he grew up in the RSS, he moved to the BJP. He was an important part of the BJP's growth into a national party. He became chief minister of Gujarat. Under his time in Gujarat, Modi oversaw a pogrom, as in he didn't oversee it, but basically in 2002, there was a pogrom. By all evidence that journalists and legal scholars have been able to gather, and it appears that Modi told law enforcement to stand down while these pogroms that were led by Hindu nationalists against Muslims in Gujarat, he told them, the police, to stand down. And it was seen as a collaboration. And this kind of collaboration was the evidence was so convincing that until Modi became prime minister, he was banned from entering the United States on grounds of violating religious freedom. And in fact, his visa reversal was cited when Joe Biden said that Mohammed bin Salman couldn't be banned or sanctioned by the United States after MBS became like the prime minister of Saudi Arabia. So that's the man and the movement that have now occupied the halls of power in India for the last 11 years. Some of the main ways in which the BJP and the Hindu nationalist movement have transformed India into a Hindu nationalist state are through kind of three buckets of things. One is targeting of minorities, another is crushing dissent, and the third is these elections that I mentioned at the beginning. So the hallmark of Hindu nationalism is truly a systemic Islamophobia, but it is also turning into anti-minority violence, not just against Muslims, but against Christians, Sikhs, people who are Adivasi, people who are from caste-oppressed communities. At the local and state level in BJP-run states, you will see anti-conversion laws, so laws that are supposed to prevent people from being forcibly converted. But in reality, what they do is create permission structures for mobs to attack prayer services, harass individuals who are in interfaith marriages, for example. You also have demolition drives. So oftentimes when you have a pogrom or a riot that happens along religious lines, the Muslims where this violence has happened will be punished and their houses will be demolished. You're also seeing this deportation of Muslims happening at the same time, especially in recent months, primarily of Bengali-speaking Muslims, but who are being labeled as quote unquote Bangladeshi illegal, undocumented, or as they would say, illegal immigrants. But at the same time, they're kind of using language as a marker for religious identity and therefore trying to take away the statehood of Muslims and at the same time criminalizing speaking Bengali. And this is part of a larger project to conditionalize citizenship in India based on faith. So in 2020, a bill was introduced called the Citizenship Amendment Act, which fast-tracked citizenship for immigrants who are not Muslims into India. But it also started creating a burden for Indian Muslims to prove their citizenship. And so there have been many ways in which deportations are one of them, these demolitions as well, for Indian Muslims to prove that they are citizens of India. And oftentimes they don't have the documents, and so they're forced into statelessness, or that is the goal, is to force Indian Muslims into statelessness. And then lastly, among the anti-minority violence is there is hate speech happening from Hindu faith leaders, but also from the Prime Minister himself. Just this week, there was a video that came out of the Prime Minister bullying a university student who is Muslim, and just because he's Muslim. And that's kind of an extraordinary thing for a head of state to do to anybody, but particularly because of this college student is like a Muslim, to target him because of his faith. But this has created a permission structure for pogroms and other forms of mob violence against Muslims. And then because the hate speech is happening and these mobs are not being punished, the hate speech is then rewarding more Islamophobic violence, and that creates a cycle. It's also starting to spill over into the way anti-Christian violence is happening, and then there's anti-caste violence, and these two things overlap because oftentimes the Christians and even the Muslims who are the most targeted for violence come from caste oppressed communities. And so the church services or the mosque services that are most attacked are in communities that are or at houses of worship that serve the poorest or the most marginalized people who happen to be Christian or Muslim. But that violence is also now kind of spilling over, not now, but it has always been anti-caste and anti-Adivasi. And so even if you are not Christian or Muslim and you're from these caste or cultural communities, you are under attack. And now you have this perception that being a good Hindu or a good upper caste Hindu means you have to impose this kind of worldview. So that's the anti-minority violence. You also have laws that have been used to crush dissent. So the first one is the use of anti-terror laws. This is common across the world, that anti-terror laws have been used to crush dissent. So the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act is the big law, and it allows up to 7 years, usually, of bail, of pretrial detention without bail. But people have been in jail for even longer than that. The most recent case that has come up in the news is the case against Omar Khalid, Shajil Imam, and Gulfish Fatima, and 6 other people who are student leaders who've been in jail for 5 years without a trial. The Delhi High Court just denied them bail again. But as of today, 3 of them, the 3 that I just named, have asked the Supreme Court to review their bail case. But there are thousands of people who've been arrested or are in jail under the UAPA. And this is a law that has a 2% conviction rate. You also see the income tax department being used to raid media houses and civil society organizations that criticize the Indian government. The government uses anti-corruption laws like the Prevention of Money Laundering Act and the Foreign Contribution Regulations Act to shut down civil society orgs that they accuse of laundering money or of accepting illegal foreign donations. This has happened to Amnesty International, for example, which is why they've not been able to continue their work in India. You also see the PMLA being used to attack opposition, and this is really infamous. An opposition politician may face a PMLA charge, and then if they switch to the BJP, those charges go away. If they don't, they will continually be harassed and even jailed. This is called the washing machine in India. And during the last election, opposition leaders Arvind Kejriwal and Hemant Soren were jailed under this law. And then the last thing is that while news outlets that are independent face attacks from the income tax department, from other parts of the Indian government, a lot of the revenues have been shifted so that there's a profit motive for news outlets to report news that is favorable to the government and to oligarchs who are friendly with the government. So the Adani Group and the Ambani family have taken over two major news outlets, and through there are able to control narratives. And they work with the government of India to stop critics from saying too much, either about these oligarchs themselves or about the Modi government. And one of the really important ways that's happened is in the last few years, there's been a case against the Adani Group and accusations of corruption. Anytime someone in India wants to talk about it, you see both the press go after that person and also the government of India go after them. The last thing is that elections in India are unfair. So you can already see how dissent is twisted in India. Like, you can't dissent, right? The playing field is also very uneven. If the press is structured in such a way that you have to share narratives that are pro government and not necessarily independent of the government or any political party. And on top of all of that, there have been real allegations over the last year or so that the Election Commission may not have acted in the best faith way. This stems from a change in the structure of the Election Commission that happened in 2024, where the panel to select commissioners became more partisan. And opposition leaders have now kind of alleged that the ECI and the BJP have colluded to manipulate voter rolls and through that steal elections. Obviously, if the opposition is saying something, that's not enough, but a lot of journalists have also reported that some of the manipulation that the opposition has alleged does check out, and particularly deletions of voters from the voter rolls, especially voters from minority communities, voters who are poor or are women. Those voters have been disproportionately affected by voter deletions. And we have both academic analysis of this from 2019, but also we're seeing more and more of this data coming out through reporting on the ground, particularly in Bihar, which is going through a special intensive review. At the same time, the special intensive review has required voters, created a new burden for voters to prove their ID, almost like a voter ID policy, to stay on the voter rolls. People who are alive have been deemed dead and don't necessarily have documents to be able to show that they are actually here. So that's a lot happening in India, but yeah, that's an overview.
Thank you so much for that, Ria. That was so informative. And thank you for the reminder, and this is so valid in the US context as well, that the Modi government used an existing architecture of repression and didn't entirely invent their own. And a couple of quick housekeeping notes that I forgot to share earlier. One is that if you have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will address questions after all the panelists have spoken. And also there was a question in the chat about if the recording will be shared, and the answer is yes. We will share the recording with everyone who has registered for this webinar. And now I'm going to introduce our next panelist, Arjun Sethi. Arjun Singh Sethi is a community activist, human rights lawyer, author, and law professor based in Washington, D.C. He works closely with Muslim, Arab, South Asian, and Sikh communities throughout the world. Arjun's work has appeared in numerous national outlets, including CNN, The Guardian, Politico, USA Today, and The Washington Post. And he has been widely quoted in print, radio, and TV, including by the New York Times, The Independent, BBC World Radio, and NPR. On to you, Arjun.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. Ria framed and set up the conversation really nicely. The Modi government has crushed dissent at home, is attacking civic spaces of all kinds, and for the most part has enjoyed impunity despite those human rights violations. And so now what we've seen is that the Modi government is increasingly exporting that authoritarian agenda across the world, including to North America. And one of the ways in which they have been doing that is through what we call transnational repression, targeting those who dare to criticize the Modi government. So Muslims, Sikhs, Dalits, Kashmiri activists, and others who protest, who organize, who put together webinars, conversations like this, could experience transnational repression. And transnational repression can take many different forms. There have been reports of stalking. There have been reports of surveillance, of elements connected to the Indian government showing up at gurdwaras, showing up at other institutions, asking invasive questions of those who attend and participate at these institutions. We've seen Americans who have overseas citizenship in India have it summarily revoked without any type of explanation, the assumption being that their citizenship from India was revoked because of their activism in the United States. We've had American nationals have visas denied, try to enter India, be turned away at the border. We've also seen US technology companies really serve as handmaidens to Indian authoritarianism, meaning folks will put out posts containing information along the lines that Ria just shared on X, on Instagram, on YouTube. And that content will be blocked in India by these social media companies at the request of the Indian government. We've also seen transnational repression take the form of violence and even murder. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about the North American Sikh assassination program that the Modi government had in place for several years. And so in June 2023, just days before Modi was welcomed at the White House, welcomed at the United States Congress, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a Canadian Sikh, was murdered in Vancouver. He was shot more than 30 times just outside of Gurdwara. It was framed to be an act of gang violence. And yet those of us who followed the issue closely suspected something was amiss. And then, of course, we later learned from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who took to the halls of the Canadian Parliament and basically said that Mr. Nijjar was assassinated at the order of the Indian government. We then learned that it wasn't just an isolated case, that the Indian government just days later tried or was engaged in an attempt to assassinate Gurpatwant Singh Pannoon in Brooklyn, New York. And in the days, weeks, and months that followed, we learned that both Canadian police and the FBI warned dozens of Sikh activists that their lives could be in danger too. Of course, the Indian government claims these individuals are terrorists because many of them advocate for a sovereign state in India called Khalistan. And yet, the United States government, the Canadian government, hasn't arrested any of these individuals. The Indian government has failed to provide any evidence linking any of these individuals to organized crime, to terrorism. Rather, these individuals were engaged in lawful protected speech. You may disagree with their political beliefs. You may disagree with how they express themselves. But these individuals were engaged in constitutionally protected activities. And yet that is why the Indian government tried to assassinate them, and at least in the case of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, succeeded in a gruesome, violent way. Let me talk a little bit about the impact of this transnational repression. As you can surmise, it can have a chilling effect. Individuals who fear that they could be tracked, who fear that they may not be able to visit their families. There have been instances of people who've spoken out in this country whose families have been bothered in India and Kashmir. That's real. And so some people have been discouraged from engaging in some of this protected activity, in some of this protected speech. In other cases, people have become even more engaged when thinking about the ways in which the Indian government continues to target people under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act that Ria pointed out. And so when we think about the transnational repression today and what we've learned about it, a few things come to mind in terms of what activists and what the communities here are calling for. One, we want the transnational repression to end. Right? We want to be sure that those who engage in activism, those who speak out for civil and human rights in India, are allowed to do so, free from foreign intervention, free from foreign hindrance. We also believe that those who were connected and responsible for the assassination program targeting Sikhs in North America be held responsible, no matter how senior. And so the Washington Post actually revealed just a year ago that Amit Shah, Modi's home minister and second in command, was fully in the know about that program. And so we want accountability. In addition to transnational repression, we've also seen sort of the long arm of Hindutva nationalism take other forms. We've seen them attempt to, and in some cases succeed at rewriting textbooks and how they describe the history of the RSS, the history of Hindutva nationalism, some of which, again, Ria already has laid out. Just several years ago, there was a bill in California to ban caste discrimination. It would have been the first bill of its kind in the United States. It got to Governor Newsom's desk, and he vetoed it. We still don't have a comprehensive understanding of ultimately what happened, but it's our belief that certain elements got to him. And so again, that's another example of you had a measure that was pushed for by a wide coalition of both national organizations and civil and racial justice organizations in California, and a Democratic governor in a liberal state vetoed that bill. There's now a transnational bill in California, a bill specifically on training of law enforcement professionals to help identify transnational repression, that it's working its way through the California legislature. There was a bill last year. It got stuck in committee. Now it's working its way through. And here, too, there's fear that if it gets through the legislature, Governor Newsom may veto it again because of the elements that we've described. A couple of other points I'll share, and then I'll kind of just sort of pass it on. At times, we've seen some of these elements also align with MAGA elements in the United States. The idea being that just as certain people in the MAGA community feel that white folks are under undue threat, people analogize that in the Hindu nationalist context and say they too are under threat. And so we've seen that kind of alignment. We've also seen dark money in politics. And again, we've more recently seen more diffuse forms of TNO. And so institutions, individuals in the United States who may not be connected to the Indian government or may be loosely connected to the Indian government, smearing activists, smearing organizations in the United States who are trying to speak truth to power, given what's happening in India today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Arjun, for explaining the extent to which people here in North America are impacted by this authoritarian government halfway across the world. And finally, our last speaker of the day is Abha Muralidharan. Abha is a researcher whose work explores the intersections of resistance and state violence in India. Currently, she is contributing to the Disappearance Project at the Polis Project, which examines how the Indian state erases communities and bodies through extractive, carceral, and authoritarian practices. Her past roles span public health communication, youth advocacy, disaster response, and grassroots mobilization with NGOs and people's movements. With a master's in gender studies from Ambedkar University, Delhi, and a background in visual media, Abha is studying colonialism and the new forms of state formations. On to you, Abha.
Thank you, Basudji. And thank you, Ria and Arjun, for sort of laying this out. And I feel like I cannot begin talking today without naming Palestine, Congo, Sudan, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon. These names, they sit in my throat like stones. And as India has signed a new bilateral tie with Israel just 3 days ago, it becomes, I think, even more important for me to lay these names down. And with the world literally on fire, I think it feels really, really important to mention these names. And perhaps there is one word that holds some kind of meaning as language itself seems like it's slipping away from our hands, is liberation. And I think the call for liberation from occupation and imperialism is where I think I want to begin. And before beginning as well, the photographs or the posters that you see, the posters have not been made by me. They were made by this collective called Kadak Collective during the anti-CAA protests. The photographs are just a collage from 2019 specifically, sort of colored down from 2019 to 2000 right now, 25 January, when I was reporting. The world really, I mean, I'm going to read this out so that I don't miss out any points. The world has really not exited colonialism, and thus the title of today, Democratic Backsliding and People's Resistance in India, feels a little heavy. Because it does something. When we call independence, when we say that India gained independence, it really wasn't a clean break. And as Ria also said, it has been a continuous process. And a system governed through the empire cannot really become democracy just because Britain left. The modern nation state carries forward the infrastructures of the empire, which is the police, the prison, the penal code, the census, the bureaucracy, the borders. These really are not neutral tools. They were designed specifically to classify and extract and control bodies and land. And they still do. In India, this inheritance is compounded by caste and feudal power that plays even today. Hierarchies that colonialism and capital did not dismantle, but instead, in India, what it does is it sort of re-engineers and institutionalizes every single time there is a point of crisis. And here really is that aporia. The promise of democracy was built on this simultaneous occupation of territories and people. This united nation that the world sort of listens to every single time India is mentioned is forged based on the militarization of the northeast, of Kashmir, of Bastar, and many other places. Federalism as a concept and practice was not a celebration of difference, but instead its containment through the trauma of partition that even today decides who is a citizen and who isn't, who is legitimate and who isn't, and who should show documents and who shouldn't. Democracy that speaks the language of freedom, but it the arms of the colonial state really reaches into the lives and the homes of people. And thus, what we are witnessing today in India is not really a fall and a backsliding, but instead it is a continuation of these litany of laws, of systems, and socialities that India was able to make in the last 75 years. And thus, I think one can read repression and resistance, as the title says, people's resistance in India. This kind of resistance also comes from that repression and the litany of repression that India has been meeting upon its people. The name, the world's largest democracy, I think, has been exported quite a lot. Even today, it is exported quite a lot. And through the process of such an incantation, the it almost feels like it's psychic, where the disposition, the caste question, purity that caste follows, the silences and pain and suffering of people is pushed aside. And these are not secrets, what I've been just saying, these are not secrets. These are known. Everybody knows this. Villages have been erased, slums are created and then demolished, homes are bulldozed, and Ria did mention about this new thing that India has learned from Israel, which is punitive demolition, where without any court orders, without any system in place of checks and balances, the state goes and just bulldozes homes. The air in India is polluted, rivers are polluted, animals have gone extinct, and languages, many languages have disappeared, so to speak. And this is how primitive accumulation in the whole classical Marxist sense sort of really works when capital and caste come together, which is what has been happening in India, but has been accelerated under Narendra Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party. Because the fuel for the party comes from these questions of how caste plays out, and the money that the Bharatiya Janata Party has been able to get from corporates. And it's when these two things come together, then it it is it's like you sort of push away every single thing that disturbs this propaganda of what a democracy is, because it is in the name of democracy that every single act of repression is done in India. For example, the case of Bhima Koregaon, where every year Dalits celebrate the defeat of the Brahmin Peshwas under the colonial rule of Britain. The state turned this entire memory of remembering something upside down, going after poets, activists, lawyers, intellectuals, professors, and singers who have been fighting caste, who've been fighting capital, who have been fighting corporates by planting Israeli technology called Pegasus on laptops. And then this particular case enters a black hole where nothing makes sense except the lesson that you can remember, but at your own peril. And this is one of the way in which this kind of system of totalitarianism has been built in India. In Bastar, the violence, the presence of military has always been there. It's not something new. Even under the Congress regime, the state went after Adivasis in Bastar in the name of Green Hunt. There was something called Salva Judum, and the Supreme Court came out with an order against Salva Judum. But now, what is happening in Bastar as we speak now is something called Operation Kagar, which is time bound. According to Amit Shah, the second in command, has he has given a deadline which is March 2026, and before March 2026, um, Adivasis of the entire area, in the name of curbing Naxalism and Maoism, they are looking at um, killing Adivasis in the area so that they have complete access to land, which means access to minerals. And this access has been made possible by amending the Mines and Minerals Act. In Jharkhand, there was this discourse that the state ran, and the entire BJP, along with its tentacles, they ran this discourse during the elections, which spoke about Bangladeshi infiltration. And when civil society and the people of that particular area went and sort of studied that place, they got to know that there has been no case of Bangladeshi infiltration. And the order came from the local court. And the data over there stands in complete contrast to what the court has to say. And in the process, what really came out was that so the way the entire discourse was constructed was that it was an Adivasi man who went to the court saying that there is an infiltration. But then it turns out that Adivasis are actually leaving that place where they are really in danger, not because of Bangladeshi infiltration, but because of years of industrialization, of mines, of this kind of rapid development. In and thus these are also the places where protests are happening. They are fighting the state. People are fighting in their own ways, either as protest sites or in their own ways, they're fighting the machinery. And one of the places that really saw that moment of rupture was Delhi and the borders of Delhi when the farmers rose up. And this rising was obviously not sudden. It was the long unconscious of the agrarian distress. Years of debt, suicide, abandonment, humiliation, and caste violence that found speech. And the farm laws obviously were the spark, the three farm laws that the Bharatiya Janata Party implemented, and these farm laws were obviously serving the corporates. And so that the godowns really open up to the corporates, and that is how the farmers and laborers hit the streets. But at the backdrop of this was the Green Revolution, and often in textbooks and in the so-called public, space, public platforms, Green Revolution is celebrated as this tryst with abundance, where Punjab becomes that rice bowl and food bowl that provides to the nation, provides to the world, where you're exporting food. But as you go deeper into what Green Revolution, what colonialism, what that logic of capitalism did over there, has been turning peasant economies into laboratories for chemical inputs for high yield extraction. And this form of monocropping killed diversity. This form of plantation driven work has destroyed soil, has um, led to a massive water shortage. And apart from that, it has also led to many cases of cancer cases, where almost I think every single day people even today go to Bikaner to get treatment, or in the process of going to get treatment to Bikaner in Rajasthan, they die because of cancer. And Punjab is not the only state. Punjab, Maharashtra, many other places have seen massive farmer suicides. More than 4 lakh people have committed suicide, and this is based on official data, so these are conservative numbers. I am not getting into women who commit suicide or people who do not really commit suicide as a spectacle, but then who withdraw because of depression and then eventually die, which does not enter these numbers and data records. But this is exactly what um, the kind of uh, rapid industrialization has done. And this green revolution, this form of agriculture production, um, is what gets denied. This pain of rural India is what gets denied in popular media, and that is where I feel people like Sidhu Moosewala uh, came out, and he began to write songs. He began to speak to the masses about this deep pain that people have been witnessing. And that is exactly what you also see, not just during the 2020 farmers movement, but even as you go to Shambhu border, now the state destroyed that entire place. It bulldozed the protest site. It put the state literally put people behind bars while destroying the protest site. And it is this dress that you witnessed, we all witnessed, and even now we are witnessing with the floods that have happened in not just Punjab, but then almost 2 million people have been affected in Pakistan because the water had to be let out into Pakistan. Um, and at the same time, as you see in the photographs, these are photographs from Shambhu border when I was there. This particular photo that you see in front of you was taken where the state really came down on farmers and laborers because the Kisan movement 2.0, they expanded they expanded their scope because water, as I said, the water content, the water table has been reducing. But at the same time, farmers and laborers realized that the first farmers movement was indeed a success, but the logic of capital and extraction and monopoly has come back through a backdoor entry with the amendment of the cooperative law. So now the movement has expanded its scope, and it is really demanding one basic thing, that stop killing Adivasis, stop killing farmers, killing laborers, stop killing people so that few people can become richer and richer with each passing day. And what we saw over there, what I mean, I was there, but what really we saw over there was state coming down, not just in with lathi charging people, but these drones, these tear gas that was thrown at farmers were Israeli made. They were Israeli drones that were used. So there is this from Bastar to Punjab and other places, there is this um, connection that you see between India and Israel with its. I mean, India is one of the largest importers of Israeli technology, intelligence, and weapons and defense technologies. And that goes the same with the anti-CAA protest, where it was just these liturgies of lies and betrayal that sort of emerged, and then it came out as a bursting open of this wound during the anti-CAA protests, um, where the questions of what law would mean, what is the life of a law, which body matters and does not matter came into question. But that repression, what we saw for over 100 days, women and people were on the streets of Delhi, but all across the country, they were protesting. But what we saw over there was a complete clampdown later on with a deadly pogrom that happened in the national capital. And that's the UAPA case that Ria was talking about, FIR number 59, where most people who were actually victims and who were working on community building were slapped with anti-terror law, UAPA, and they were put behind bars. And all of this, for like the farmers movement and the anti-CA movement sort of happened at the same time. And what followed were incarcerations, killings, assassinations. Sidhu Moosewala was assassinated. We don't know by who, but it nevertheless. Um, and through this entire process, sort of to wrap this entire thing up, entire process have anti movement, people, the state does instead of um, giving some kind of relief is that it further pulls away all security, social security systems from people. So it goes after reduction of budgets. Every single year, if you follow the budgets, there has been reduction in the health sector. There is mass unemployment. Over the past 5 years, unemployment has increased. And even schemes like Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act that sort of really gives labor and dignity to the hands of people, that has been taken away. So people really are jobless. Poor people from India, mostly from caste oppressed communities, are ready to go to Israel to work. And this is after October 7th, 2023. So you see that kind of movement also happening. So um, this entire design of uh, killing people, of really putting an entire population under siege, uh, sort of uh, is made systemic by these policies, by these laws, and that law also, I mean, sort of also wrap up. This law, it's not just the Indian Penal Code, but then India has changed its criminal law with the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. And the sedition law has come back. UAPA has been placed inside the law. Section 69 has been a new addition, which Ria had told about, going after intercaste marriages and interreligious marriages. So by law, you can't get married to somebody who is outside of your caste, who is outside of your religion. There is a new law called Digital Personal Data Protection Act that makes it impossible to seek information from the state. And if you do, we've seen narratives right now where the Delhi High Court 2 days ago that it basically went after people saying that you can't seek information about Adani and you can't mention Adani's name. So these ways in which laws are made so that there is extraction is where today we are. Um, I don't know where to place hope, but if I were to learn something from the people of this country and share it here, it has been that one shouldn't abandon oneself and leave the space that we have fought for so long, and abandon anything for that matter, so that people in power remain in power. And with that, I'll leave it here, and maybe we can talk about it.
Thank you so much, Abha. And we have a question in the chat, but since we do have almost half an hour left, before we go to the questions in the chat, I have a couple of questions for the panelists. And so my first question, and Abha and Arjun, you both alluded to this. Abha, you talked about the relationship between India and Israel today. And Arjun, you mentioned how the Hindu nationalists in the US have been identifying with the MAGA right. So, sort of following from that, to what extent, in your view, is the Indian Hindu nationalist far right aligned with similar, what I call in shorthand, new right movements that are emerging in various parts of the world? For example, in the US or in many European countries, Hungary particularly sticks out. Um, and even in places like South Korea and Brazil, etc. And also, to what extent is it unique and different? And I'd love to hear perspectives from all three of you on this. Whoever wants to start.
I'm happy to start. So I think the Hindu nationalist movement, partially it's like, it's been around for so long and it's been so continual for so long, which sometimes you'll see, the far right come and go, right, in some places, and they may draw on historical things. Let's say in Brazil, Bolsonaro draws on the history of the military dictatorship. In Spain, the far right will draw on the history of Franco, but like in Spain, for example, or even in the US, right, you have the far right drawing on a historical example, but there's this moment where it's like socially unacceptable, or they're in the margins, or but in India, there's always been that, in independent India, there's always been this push and pull. And even when the RSS was on the margins, it was still like influencing politics in a more dominant way than maybe you wouldn't have like heard about the KKK in polite society for a moment in American politics. And because of that, the far right has changed in the US, whereas I think in India, it's not. But at the same time, right, Steve Bannon has platformed Hindu nationalists in India on his platforms. Eric Trump yesterday was going after Zoran Mamdani, saying that he's criticized not just Israel Netanyahu, but Modi in India, and saying he's anti-Indian because of it. Like there are all these ways in which explicitly and implicitly the MAGA movement is learning lessons from India, applying them here, and trying to build those connections, even as there is a part of MAGA that is very explicitly anti-Indian or racist towards Indians, or at least Indians in this country. They're still pulling from everybody. And as Arjun also mentioned, right, there are tons of Indian Americans who are in the Trump White House and carrying out policies that are aligned with the far right.
I would just add, and thanks again, Ria, for that context, is that the strategies are similar, right? And so I think if Trump could shut down the internet, he would, right? He would. And so when you think about the weaponizing of counterterrorism laws, we don't have our own version of UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, but I think if Trump had his way, he would have something like that. When you look at that order that just came down from the Supreme Court, that 6-3 opinion, and 3 dissenting judges wrote a sort of scalding dissent because the majority allows for ICE agents to basically use race and ethnicity to profile people, throw them to the ground, ask them for identification. And so when you just think about, again, the persecution of civil society, the targeting of journalists, in the United States, you're seeing the targeting of racial justice activists, those who advocate for Palestine, those who are involved with climate justice. You're just seeing similar kind of authoritarian strategies by all of these authoritarian regimes. They're just all kind of at a different point on the scale.
I think one similarity is obviously the idea of what purity means and who is pure and who is impure, and the paranoia that they sort of built. and which is what India has been learning from not just Mussolini and Hitler and them, but now prioritize the finance minister of Israel coming, and then he's saying that Hindutva and Zionism share the same thing, and I agree. That paranoia is built on that. That Hindus are pure, and thus the idea of caste really that's how it works also, right? That kind of rigid system where people don't meet each other, and there is this apartheid, and creating this common enemy, and wanting that kind of eugenic practice, and this kind of eugenic practice, and thus this has been working since 1947. It's not something new. And thus it was very easy for, I mean, historically also, if you look, it was very easy for RSS to enter even Congress party, and work through the Congress party to form the Jansangh and form a coalition against Indira Gandhi. So that I think is the similarity, but I think I don't know if it is dissimilarity, but it is the way in which RSS strategizes and changes its strategy, because India is such a vast country and so different, that what works in one place may not work in another place. Like you can't come to Kerala or some other place in Northeast or Goa and then say you can't have beef. You can't go to a place like Haryana and say, oh, everybody please start believe in God, because that's not how culturally Haryana works, right? So culturally it's different. India is not this homogeneous thing. So the attempt is really to homogenize. And thus they've been able to strategize differently in different ways.
Thank you. And just a reminder to our audience to please put any questions you may have for the panelists in the chat. And there is a very interesting question, in the Q&A. And there is a very interesting question in the Q&A, but before I get to that, I'd love to ask the panelists one other question, which is, and this is a vast and open-ended question, but please, answer it to the extent that you can, which is, what do you see as a path for movements in India to defeat the authoritarian takeover happening right now without returning to the pre-Modi status quo? So recognizing that India has always been a deeply flawed democracy, so not making this about a return to some mythical perfect democracy of the past. What is the path for movements in India to do that right now?
I'll just say really quickly, I think this demythologizing, the demythologizing, right, of Indian democracy is an important first step, right? To just understand that this moniker, world's largest democracy, it's not true under Modi, and it hasn't been true for some time for a lot of the reasons that we've learned today. So a kind of honest reckoning. And I also think there's a lot to be learned from a movement like the farmers' protest. I think that's one of the reasons that, for example, the Indian government has been retaliating against, Sikhs in North America. I think that moment showed what the power of people can look like. And I know that there's a question, in the chat about like the size of India, the diversity of India. And that was a moment where you saw millions of people take to the streets and in some ways win, right? Because you saw a people power and what it could look like. But it isn't easy. It isn't easy. And the ways in which civic space is shrinking, the ways in which the Modi government is trying to foster this divide and conquer ideology, makes it sort of that promise of democracy and equality, it makes it more elusive by the day.
To that, I mean, everything Arjun said. I think part of that is also a lot of the laws we've talked about, particularly the UAPA and these other anti-terrorism laws, the PSA, the Public Safety Act and Kashmir, getting rid of those and not replacing them with equally draconian anti-terror laws is a really important step. And a lot of the other tools that have been used to undermine democratic rights in India. But I think another part of this is like a cultural and societal reckoning. On one hand, having a reckoning about like what Hindu nationalism has done to the societal fabric of India. I think India has never been like this perfectly wonderful place, but like for a lot of people, the romance of or the promise of a place where you can be who you are and like you just by virtue of being in the subcontinent, you're there and it's a celebration, like actually building a world where that is true will require repairing these connections between Hindu, Muslim, other faith communities, but also the thing that I think South Asia has never done, which is to annihilate caste and truly do so, right? And I mean, I can't completely tell you all the ways and how that would look and what that means for people from caste oppressed communities, but I can say like from within the Hindu community, that means contending with how do you create a Hindu identity where you can divorce caste from faith, which is something that a lot of people who are Hindu, who are not upper caste, I mean, they are always thinking about this. But also for those of us who are in like that part of society that is upper caste, right? Like being able to disentangle what we think are religious practices from cultural practices from versus caste practices. And like imagining a world where we give up some of the privilege and power we have to build a better world. That is something that needs to happen. I think there are people who are thinking about this in India. They have always thought about this in India, but it has to become a much more mainstream conversation. And I think it has to happen within like that framework of what does Hindu life look like when you take away Islamophobia, other forms of bigotry, casteism? How do you build that new Hindu world, right? For, 80% of Indians who identify as Hindu.
Arjun and Ria, I think, covered most of it. I don't know what might help or what might start the process. But from what has been happening, and I think I just saw somebody comment, when it comes to changing history, it's not just about the syllabus that's been changed. I mean, the way history. I mean, I remember somebody saying this, that if you want to create an identity based on history, then you have to tweak history, right? So that's what the RSS and BJP has been doing. But what do you do when schools are being shut down, when children do not have access to education? And this is a country where majority of people go to school not to study but to have access to food. And thus, where is their knowledge system coming from, right? Where is it being created from? Uh, and even if there is somebody who crosses all of these barriers, right, who goes to primary school, who crosses that primary school, who comes to higher education, um, within higher education, there is privatization right now. So basically, every single public space is being obliterated. So the rural and the urban are not meeting. The rich and poor are not meeting. Uh, the, I mean, the divisions are so much that there is no possibility of these parallel lines sort of in any way interjecting anywhere. So narratives are not clashing. It's this psychic way of moving from one kind of um, bubble to another kind of delusional bubble. So I don't know what is really the way in which it can, but then as Arjun and Riya said, one way is to just accept the reality that is not a democracy and stop. Every single time something happens, I think I'm irritated when people say that, oh, democracy is dead. I'm like, democracy has died long ago. It's not like, you have to kill it. So that is one. And the second, see, the laws, the way it, not just anti-terror law, but then there are so many laws that need repeal. It's not just UAPA that has to go. It's not just sedition that has to go. It is not these visibly repressive laws that have to go. But then what is the idea of law itself requires larger conversations. And that I think will perhaps open up these spaces where people can really begin to talk to each other. People are not talking to each other, Basaji, and I think that is something that, and by talking to each other, I mean now algorithms have been shut down with the exodus, the migrant exodus that happened during COVID, where so you had Instagram and then you had TikTok. TikTok got banned. The algorithm was one place. I mean, Instagram algorithm was one place where the migrants of rural India really began to speak, and they were telling the world that there is no food, there is no job, there is violence, caste violence. But then that space got completely dismantled, right? So there is really no space left for conversations to happen. It's these ruptures that are happening every single time. So if you're, I think, able to create those tiny little spaces where people can talk to each other, I think that will take us a long way forward. And just ending it here, one thing that the farmers movement at least taught me was technology and talking on digital spaces did not bring these people out. It was the hard work of unions that went, they did door-to-door campaign, they took pamphlets, they went to each and every single person, and that is how people came out onto the streets and they fought. So that's, I think, these public, saving the public space, saving these public conversations, I think would take us somewhere.
Good reminder about the importance of good old-fashioned organizing. It's always so powerful. So there's a very interesting question in the Q&A that Abha, you had alluded to this earlier. This question is from Alyssa Greenberg, and it says, one interesting parallel I see between India and the US is the sheer size, both population and geography. Has India's size and diversity, I would say, contributed to its successes fighting against creeping autocracy? And how have activists succeeded in organizing across distance? And has the decentralized nature of resistance been helpful? Or alternatively, has this size not actually been an obstacle for authoritarianism? Any one of you can start.
I'm gonna start because this reminded me of something I heard from a Pakistani activist actually, about, even though in 2025 Indian democracy is non-existent, let's just be honest. They were like, well, Indian activists have a little bit of luxury to be able to call out what the Indian government is doing just by the sheer size of India. Right? There are so many people, and it's a lot harder in a place like Pakistan, which, even though it is one of the 5 largest countries, it's still not 1.5 billion people. And so the sheer size of India, I think, does help. But also, I feel like the size of India is both helpful and it's like a double-edged sword because of the diversity. People, for example, will vote for the BJP or for the BJP alliance, the NDA, not because they support Hindu nationalism, but because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And this happened in Maharashtra during the Lok Sabha elections, where in Adivasi communities, they voted against the opposition, the national opposition, the India Alliance, not because they support the BJP or Hindu nationalism, but because the Maharashtra party that was running for the India Alliance in their constituencies, the Shiv Sena, has a very long history of anti-indigenous policies and violence in that region. And so people were voting for local issues. And you see this kind of play out throughout India, and it doesn't necessarily, like, only 40% of people in the elections voted for the BJP, and that is kind of the sentiment you see. But it's, when you have so much diversity, it doesn't mean that everybody's coalescing around the same ideas. But it also means that there may be ways in which, like, the BJP's grip politically may be weaker than what it is perceived as. The loudness, the size of India means that the loudness of Hindu nationalists feels overwhelming, but again, the size and diversity of India also means that actually that's overstated.
Abha, Arjun, any thoughts
Like,
from you?
okay, yeah. I think it's an advantage and a disadvantage. By disadvantage, I mean that it it was the majority, so to speak, the poor people who actually voted for Bharatiya Janata Party in 2014. The reasons are multiple. I mean, they are really overdetermined. But one reason has been that Bharatiya Janata Party in 2014 was when it campaigned in 2014. It did not campaign in the language of religion. It actually campaigned in the language of development. It promised the people something. And that promise, and which is why I think I'm a little uncomfortable with the word hope, because it is that hope that tomorrow I will get food, tomorrow I will get a job, tomorrow there is a better tomorrow, that the party promised, because I mean, Modi was building up that entire profile on the Gujarat model, right, of development, of something better. But it is the same people again, because they've gone through so much. We have, as a country, gone through so much that it is this very people who cut down the votes last year. And thus, when people say that this is hope, I'm like, no, this is not hope, because what people really are saying is that they need job, they need food on the table. But it also, I mean, but every single person does not really vote for the Bharatiya Janata Party. And this is based on documentation. They do not vote because they hate Muslims or they hate somebody. M. Rajshekhar, he's documented this. He in one of the Adivasi areas in Gujarat, Adivasis voted for BJP, even though they did not have the money to travel from their village to the polling booth, because their Aadhaar card will reveal if to what political party they have voted, and that data will decide if he will get food from the ration shop or not. So that that the reasons why people vote is that minute and that different. And at the same time, and when you're talking about Hindu nationalism, the country is so vast. I mean, I come from Kerala and I come from a village, but because because of the work that I've been doing, and what people and friends have taught me, I'm able to converse in a certain way. And even there, sometimes I don't understand Haryanvi, I don't understand Punjabi. So then I'm not able to, like, when I'm saying me, it's not just me, right? We are not able to articulate. Somebody from Tamil Nadu is not able to articulate their pain and suffering to create that kind of solidarity with somebody from Punjab or some other place. It takes months and years to build that. And by the time it is built, that relationship is built based on which you can say that, hey, let's strategize and do something about this. The damage would have already occurred. So yes and no, where it is overwhelming, but at the same time, it is based on this. I mean, I want to end this over here. It is based on this population metrics that right now delimitation is going to happen. So North India, especially Hindus of North India, they are seeing a surge in terms of population growth. So the belt, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, it's seeing a surge. Southern states are going for a dip, and it's actually negative integer. States like Tamil Nadu is going for a negative integer, either because they have done their family planning, but at the same time, it's also because of other factors like caste violence or climate change and the death that comes with it. But basically, we are seeing a dip in representation. So it is this constant negotiation which leads to either this projection of Modi and power and how it works. And I think I'll just end it here. Sorry, I'll just end it here. Which I don't see many people addressing this in India, where there is so much of poverty, where caste plays a huge cultural role, religion plays a huge cultural role, God plays really a huge cultural role in defining where people do and how people behave. When Bharatiya Janata Party began to understand that they were losing votes last year, usually Modi does not, and I think everybody knows this by now. Modi hasn't given a single press conference in the last 10 years, and he comes on national television and then he says something that just blew my mind and many of our minds actually. He said something on this line that he is not biological. He talks to God, right? Now, there are two ways to read this. One is obviously a very surface level reading, which the Rahul Gandhi, the leader of opposition, also took it up in the parliament and he said, which is that, he's basically saying that he is not biological and he talks to God and, God comes in his dreams and you know, he becomes that divine receptacle. And I think that is exactly what Modi did. That all these decisions that the state and the Bharatiya Janata Party as a party has been doing is not him doing, it is God which is doing. So, how do people fight against God? You can't fight God. You can fight human beings, you can fight ideologies, you can't fight God. So, I think all of these factors sort of come together, and that's how these projections are made.
Thank you. And a lot of interesting questions have come in at the last minute, but sadly, it is time to end. I wish the questions had come in earlier. But thank you to everyone for attending. And I'm going to put my actually, I'm going to share my email with all the people who registered, so people can follow up with their questions, so that no one's question goes unanswered. But thank you to our wonderful panelists for providing us with so much insight on really difficult and painful, but also essential subject. And a huge thank you to all our attendees for staying with us for an hour and a half and engaging in this conversation. And finally, a huge thank you to you, Netfa, for handling the logistics of this event so well. And with that, bye everyone, and all attendees who are registered will receive the recording of the event. Thank you and bye-bye.